The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was the largest structure ever built by any civilization in the known universe, and it floated in silent orbit around the neutral world of Volunus Prime, like a metal moon made of glass and ambition. Thousands of species filled its curved halls every single day, and each one believed with absolute certainty that they were the most important beings in the room. The insectoid Chirek clicked their mandibles and whispered through pheromone clouds as they moved in clusters of 6 or 7, always watching, always judging. The crystalline Valori glided across the polished floors, and their translucent bodies caught the light of 100 stars, streaming through the observation windows, turning them into living prisms. The Drakvon stood in the corners like living statues of war, and their armored plates were thick enough to stop plasma rounds, and their eyes burned red beneath helmets that had not been removed in centuries. Then there were the Nethari, who were not really there at all, but existed as shimmering clouds of sentient gas, hovering near the ceiling, and humming in frequencies that made lesser species feel a strange sadness they could never explain. Into this grand and terrifying circus walked Ambassador Elena Vasquez, the first permanent representative of the human species to the Galactic Council. She was not tall, and she was not armored, and she did not glow or hover or emit clouds of chemical language. She was a woman of 43 years, with dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, and a gray diplomatic uniform that had been ironed twice that morning because she had been nervous, and ironing helped her think. Her delegation was small, just 4 people, and they walked behind her with the careful steps of creatures who understood very clearly that they were surrounded by beings who could crush them without effort. The council was in emergency session that day because of the Vor-Keth crisis. A territorial dispute near the Outer Rim had been growing worse for months, and millions of refugees from 3 different species had been displaced from their home systems. The Drakvon wanted war, because the Drakvon always wanted war, and they argued that a show of force was the only language the aggressors would understand. The Chirek wanted economic sanctions, because the Chirek controlled most of the galactic trade routes, and sanctions meant they could squeeze their enemies without losing a single soldier. The Valori wanted to study the situation further, because the Valori always wanted to study everything further, and they believed that enough data would eventually reveal the perfect solution to any problem. Elena sat in the human delegation seat, which was small, and placed near the back of the chamber, in a section that most species referred to as the nursery, because it was where all the new and unimportant civilizations were placed. She listened carefully, and she took notes on a small device, and she said nothing at all. During the first recess, a Chirek aide passed by her seat and clicked something to a companion, in a frequency that was just barely within human hearing range. Elena's translator caught it and converted it to words she could understand. Prey animals playing at civilization, the Chirek had said, and his companion had made a sound that was the insectoid equivalent of laughter. Elena did not react, and she did not look up from her notes, but her jaw tightened just slightly. When the session broke for the evening cycle, Elena decided to walk the station rather than return to her quarters, because the walls of her small room made her feel like she was in a box, and she had spent 14 months in a box on the ship that brought her here, and she was very tired of boxes. The observation halls of Volunus Station were beautiful in a cold and enormous way. Windows showed the swirl of stars and the pale blue curve of the planet below. She walked for a long time, until she found herself in a corridor she had not seen before, and the lights here were dimmer, and the air smelled different, like metal and something organic and old. A sign on the wall displayed symbols in 12 languages, and her translator rendered it as Restricted Biocontainment Wing, Authorized Personnel Only. Elena knew she should turn around, but there was a window at the end of the corridor, and something about it pulled her forward the way a campfire pulls a person closer on a cold night. She reached the window and looked through it. Behind reinforced plasma glass that was thicker than her entire body, stretched a massive enclosure, filled with simulated terrain of dark rock and strange red vegetation. And in the shadows, something moved. It was enormous, and Elena felt her breath catch in her chest, because her brain understood before her. Eyes did that she was looking at something that was built by evolution to kill everything it encountered. She could not see it clearly, but she could feel it watching her. And then two eyes opened in the darkness, burning amber like twin suns, and each one was larger than her head. A voice behind her made her jump, and she spun around to find a Valori aide standing there, with light pulsing nervously through their crystalline body. "That is the Jacquard," the aide said, and the translator carried a tone of deep and genuine fear. "You should not linger here, and even looking at it for too long is considered unwise by most species." Elena turned back to the glass, and the eyes were still there, fixed on her, unblinking, and ancient, and full of something she could not name. "Why is it here?" she asked. "Because it cannot be anywhere else," the aide said. "It is the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy, and 3 fleets died to capture it, and it has been here for over a decade. 200 years, and in that time no living being has entered that enclosure and survived." The aide waited for Elena to show fear, or to step back, or to hurry away, like every other delegate who stumbled upon this corridor. Elena did none of those things. She placed her hand flat against the cold glass and stared into those burning amber eyes. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not fear. Sadness. The creature was alone, and it had been alone for 200 years. And Elena Vasquez knew what loneliness looked like, because she had seen it in shelters and in zoos, and in the eyes of old dogs that no one wanted anymore. She leaned closer to the glass and whispered softly, "Hey there, big guy. You look lonely." Behind her, the Valori aide stared at the human with an expression that their species reserved for witnessing things that should not be possible. And deep inside the enclosure, the Jacquard shifted in the darkness, moved one step closer to the glass. She had returned to her quarters after the encounter in the containment wing, and she had tried to sleep, but every time she closed her own eyes, she saw those 2 amber suns staring back at her from the darkness, and they did not look like the eyes of a monster. They looked tired. The next morning, she skipped the council session entirely, which caused a small diplomatic incident, because humans were already considered unreliable, and now their only ambassador was absent from a critical vote on refugee aid. Elena did not care, because she had found something more important than politics. She went to the council archives, which were housed in a vast wing of the station, where data crystals rose from floor to ceiling like a frozen forest of light and information. The Valori maintained the archives, and they were surprised to see a human there, because most young species did not bother with research and preferred to simply argue louder than everyone else. Requested everything the council had on the Jacquard, and what she received filled her with a mixture of horror and heartbreak. The Jacquard was classified as a Class Omega extinction-level organism, which was the highest threat designation the Council had ever created, and it had been created specifically for this one species. The creature in the enclosure was roughly the size of what humans would call a city bus, and it walked on 6 powerful legs, each one ending in claws that could tear through starship hull plating. Its body was covered in bioorganic armor that was harder than most metals known to galactic science, and along its spine ran rows of quills that could extend and launch with enough force to punch through energy shields. Those quills were not just sharp. They were filled with a neurotoxin so potent that a single scratch could kill a Drakvan warrior in under 30 seconds, and the Drakvan were considered one of the hardest species to kill in the galaxy. But that was not the worst part. The Acaricia could produce a subsonic roar that operated at a frequency capable of causing organ failure in most carbon-based life forms, and it had an electromagnetic field around its body that disrupted technology within a radius of 50 meters. The Council had captured this one specimen 217 years ago during a first contact mission that went catastrophically wrong, and 3 entire battle fleets had been destroyed in the process, with a combined loss of over 40,000 lives. Since then, the creature had been held in containment and studied from a distance, and in over 2 centuries, no scientist of any species had found a way to safely approach it. Every drone sent into the enclosure was destroyed by the EM field, and every biological organism that entered triggered an immediate and lethal response. The Acaricia was the benchmark for galactic military power, and if a weapon could not theoretically kill a HFY, then it was considered insufficient for serious warfare. Elena read all of this, and then she read it again. And then she sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she pulled up the behavioral data. This was the part that the alien scientists had recorded, but never truly understood because they were looking at it through the wrong lens. The HFY showed extreme aggression in response to electrical signals, and it attacked anything that emitted pheromone-based communication. And it became violent when exposed to the sonic frequencies that most alien species naturally produced just by existing. Every species on the station emitted some combination of electromagnetic noise and chemical signals and ultrasonic vibrations just by being alive, and the station itself was a buzzing hive of all these things layered on top of each other. Elena closed her eyes and imagined it. Small room for 200 years, while every surface screamed at her in a language that felt like needles in her brain, and every living thing that came near her radiated signals that her body interpreted as an attack. She opened her eyes and said one sentence out loud to the empty archive. "It is not a monster. It is a stressed animal in a terrible enclosure." That evening, she returned to the containment corridor, and she sat down on the cold floor outside the plasma glass with her back against the wall and her legs crossed. She turned off her communicator and her translator and her datapad and every piece of technology she carried, until she was just a woman sitting in silence. Then she began to hum. It was a low and simple melody that her grandmother used to sing when Elena was small and afraid of thunderstorms, and it had no words, just a soft rising and falling sound that vibrated in her chest. For a long time, nothing happened. A sound so low it was more of a feeling than a noise, and the shadows in the enclosure shifted, and the HFY moved toward the glass. It did not charge, and it did not roar, and its quills stayed flat against its spine. It just came closer, and stood there on the other side of the barrier, with its massive head tilted slightly to one side, and its amber eyes watching her with something that was not aggression. Elena kept humming, and she did not move, and she did not look directly at the creature, because she knew from a lifetime of working with animals on Earth that direct eye contact was often interpreted as a challenge. She looked at the floor, and she hummed, and the HFY stood there and listened. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each time she sat in the same spot and turned off all her devices and hummed the same low melody. And each time, the HFY came to the glass a little sooner and stood a little closer. On the 5th day, it pressed its enormous snout against the glass directly across from where she sat, and the amber eyes closed halfway in an expression that Elena recognized immediately because she had seen it 1,000 times on Earth. It was the face of a creature that was allowing itself to feel safe. On the 6th day, the Valoroi aide found her there, and the aide's crystalline body flashed with colors that meant alarm and disbelief. Ambassador Vasquez, "What are you doing?" the aide demanded. "Sitting," Elena said, without looking up. "You are sitting outside the enclosure of the most dangerous organism in galactic history." "Yes." "You are you humming to it?" "Yes." The aide stared at her, and then stared at the Jacquard, which was pressed against the glass like an enormous armored cat, waiting for attention. And the aide made a sound that the translator could not process, because there was no word in any language for what the Thalori was feeling. Word spread quickly, because word always spreads quickly when something impossible is happening. And within days, half the junior delegates on the station knew that the human ambassador was spending her evenings singing to the galaxy's most lethal predator. The Chirec ambassador's aide reported to his superior with mandibles trembling slightly. "The human keeps visiting the Jacquard," the aide said. "She sits there every night like she is mourning with it." The Chirec ambassador was silent for a long time, and then asked a question that no Chirec had ever thought to ask about a human before. Why? The aide had no answer, because in a galaxy of 10,000 civilizations, not one of them had ever looked at the Jacquard and felt anything but fear. Not one of them had ever thought to simply sit down and be quiet and let the creature know that it was not alone. It took a human to do that, and none of them understood why. The day everything changed began with a war that had nothing to do with the Jacquard. The Drakvan warfleet had crossed the neutral border in the Vorakat sector, and the news hit the council like a shockwave, and within minutes the Grand Chamber was in chaos. Delegates screamed at each other in a dozen languages, and the Chirec released stress pheromones so thick that 3 Valerie delegates had to leave the chamber because the chemicals were clouding their crystalline bodies. And the Drakvan ambassador stood at his podium with his arms crossed and said nothing, because silence from a Drakvan was more terrifying than any threat. Emergency protocols were activated across Valunis Station, and power was rerouted to communication arrays and defense systems and shield generators. And in the rush to prepare for a potential galactic war, someone somewhere made a decision to pull energy from non-essential systems. The biocontainment wing was classified as non-essential. Elena was in the human delegation's quarters when the first alarm sounded, and it was not the political alarm that was ringing through the council chambers, but a different one, deeper and more urgent, and it came from the direction of the restricted corridor she had visited every night for the past 2 weeks. She knew instantly what it meant. The environmental controls in the containment wing had fluctuated, and the carefully maintained balance of atmospheric pressure and electromagnetic shielding and sonic dampening that kept the Jacquard calm had been disrupted. Every signal the creature hated was now flooding its enclosure at full strength. Elena ran. Her human colleagues grabbed at her arms and shouted her name, and one of them said, "Elena, the containment wing is in lockdown, you cannot go there," and she pulled free and kept running. The corridors were flashing red, and automated warnings blared in every language, telling all personnel to move away from the biocontainment wing immediately, and Elena passed a squad of Chirec security officers who were moving in the opposite direction, because they were running away. She could feel it before she saw it, a vibration in the floor, and in the walls, and in her teeth that was the subsonic roar of the Jacquard, pushing through the station's structure like an earthquake made of sound. 3 Chirec officers were on the ground near the containment corridor, and they were not dead, but they were unconscious, because the subsonic frequency had overwhelmed their nervous systems, and their mandibles twitched in involuntary spasms. Elena stepped over them and reached the observation window, and what she saw made her stomach drop. The containment field was flickering. The plasma glass barrier was still holding, but the energy shield behind it was pulsing on and off, like a dying heartbeat. And inside the enclosure, the Jacquard was in full defensive mode, were extended, and each one was as long as Elena's arm, and dripping with neurotoxin, and its electromagnetic field was surging so powerfully that the lights in the corridor were popping one by one in showers of sparks. The creature was slamming its body against the walls, and its roar was constant now. Not the controlled subsonic pulse of a hunting predator, but the desperate screaming of an animal in pain. Elena understood what was happening because she had seen it before in different forms on Earth. In dogs during fireworks, and in horses during storms, and in elephants in concrete enclosures that were too small and too loud. The Jacquard was having a panic attack. She looked at the airlock that led into the enclosure, and it had a manual override panel on the wall, a failsafe designed so that maintenance crews could enter if the electronic systems failed. A voice crackled over the station intercom, and it was the voice of the Council's emergency coordinator, speaking in clipped and terrified tones. Containment breach is imminent. All personnel evacuate sectors 7 through 12. Authorization has been requested for orbital strike on the containment wing. Repeat. Orbital strike authorization requested. They were going to kill it. They were going to fire on their own station and destroy the containment wing and kill the Jacquard, because that was the protocol. If the creature escaped, then it could kill everyone on the station, and so the only option was to destroy the entire section before that could happen. Elena walked to the airlock panel, and she entered her ambassador-level override code, and the door hissed open. An alarm screamed louder than all the others, and a new announcement rang through the station. Warning! Containment airlock has been manually opened. This is not a drill. In the Grand Chamber, the emergency session froze, and every delegate turned to the security feeds that had been projected on the main screen, and they saw a small human woman standing in the open airlock of the Jacquard enclosure. The Drakvan ambassador, who had not shown surprise in 40 years of warfare, leaned forward in his seat. Elena stepped inside. The air was thick and hot, and it smelled like ozone and iron and something ancient and wild. And the electromagnetic field hit her like a wave of static that made every hair on her body stand up, and her vision blur at the edges. The Jacquard turned toward her. It was even more enormous up close than she had imagined. A mountain of bioarmor and muscle and evolutionary perfection. And its 6 eyes locked onto her, and its quills rattled with a sound like 1,000 knives scraping against each other. Its jaws opened, and Elena could see rows of teeth designed to tear through materials that her species had not yet learned to name. She was terrified. Her hands were shaking, and her heart was beating so fast. She could hear it in her ears, and every single instinct built into the human body over millions of years of evolution was screaming at her to run. She did not run. She held her hands open, with her palms facing outward, and she began to hum, the same low melody, her grandmother's lullaby, and her voice shook, but she did not stop. She walked forward, one slow step at a time, and the Jacquard watched her, and its quills rattled, and its jaws stayed open, and the subsonic roar was so powerful this close that Elena could feel her ribs vibrating. She kept walking. 10 meters, then 8, then 5, and the creature's head lowered, and its 6 eyes narrowed, and Elena could see the neurotoxin glistening on the tips of the quills that were aimed directly at her chest. She reached out her hand. Every being watching on the security feeds held their breath. Thousands of delegates from hundreds of species across the Grand Chamber and the corridors and the core observation decks all went completely silent at the same moment. Elena placed her hand on the Jacquard's snout. The creature went still. Its quills retracted slowly, folding back against its spine like a flower closing, and its electromagnetic field dropped so suddenly that the lights in the corridor outside flickered back on, and the subsonic roar faded into silence. And then the Jacquard made a sound that no xenobiologist in the history of the Galactic Council had ever recorded, a deep and rolling vibration that came from somewhere inside its massive chest and resonated through the floor, and through Elena's hand, and through her bones. It was purring. the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy, pressed its enormous armored head into the palm of a human woman, and it purred. In the grand chamber, the Jacquard ambassador's exoskeleton clicked rapidly in an involuntary fear response, and 3 Valori delegates lost cohesion in their crystalline structures from the shock, and the Nethari, who had been hovering near the ceiling, descended lower than they had in centuries. The Drakvan ambassador sat back in his chair very slowly, and his red eyes were wide, and his clawed hands gripped the armrests so hard that the metal bent. The Chirrut ambassador turned to his aide, and his voice was barely a whisper, and it carried a weight that his species had not felt since they first looked up at the stars and realized they were not alone. What are they? No one had an answer. On the security feed, Elena Vasquez stood inside the enclosure of the apex predator of the galaxy, with her hand on its face and tears running down her cheeks, and she whispered words that the microphones barely caught. "It is okay. You are okay. I am here. You are not alone anymore." And the Jacquard, the beast that had silenced empires and destroyed fleets and haunted the nightmares of 1,000 civilizations, closed its eyes, leaned into her touch like it had been waiting 200 years for someone to say exactly that. It spread through Chirrut trade networks and Valori academic channels and Drakvan military briefings and Nethari consciousness streams, and by the time Elena woke up the next morning in the station's medical bay, where she had been taken for observation, she was the most famous human being who had ever lived, and she had not even checked her messages yet. The doctor, a Valori medical specialist whose crystalline body pulsed with soft blue light, told her that she was physically fine except for mild electromagnetic burns on her right hand and some bruising on her ribs from the subsonic exposure. Elena asked about the Jacquard, and the doctor stared at her for a long time before answering that the creature had been calm since she left the enclosure, and had not moved from the spot where she had touched it, and was still making that low vibrating sound that no one could explain. "It is still purring," Elena said, and she smiled, and the doctor made a note in the file. "Read, patient displays emotional attachment to class Omega organism. Recommend psychological evaluation," and then crossed it out, because the doctor was beginning to suspect that the human was not the one who needed to be evaluated. The council summoned Elena to a full tribunal that afternoon, and the grand chamber was more crowded than it had been in decades, because every species wanted to see the human who had done the impossible. Elena stood at the central podium, a small figure in a gray uniform with a bandaged hand, and she looked up at the thousands of alien faces staring down at her, and she was not afraid, because she had already faced the scariest thing on the station, and it had purred. The Chirrut High Speaker opened the proceedings and demanded an explanation, and his pheromones carried a scent of deep unease that made several nearby delegates uncomfortable. Elena took a breath and began to speak in simple, clear words. "I understand that what I did was shocking to all of you, and I understand that you want to know how, and I will tell you, but first I need you to understand something about humans." She paused and looked around the chamber. "You have all classified my species as prey animals, soft and slow and fragile and unremarkable. And by your standards that is probably accurate, because we do not have armor or claws or venom or electromagnetic fields." The Chirrut ambassador made a clicking sound that meant agreement, and Elena ignored it. "But you missed something important about us, because you were measuring the wrong things." She brought up a holographic display, and it showed images from Earth, a woman riding a horse, and a man swimming beside a whale shark, and a child sleeping next to a wolf, and a researcher sitting with mountain gorillas in a green forest. Humans did not survive on our world by being the strongest or the fastest. Our planet is a death world by your classification standards. And it is filled with predators and poisons and natural disasters that would terrify most species in this chamber. The Drakvan ambassador shifted slightly at the mention of a death world, because the Drakvan respected death worlds. We survived because we learned to read other creatures, to understand their body language and their emotions and their needs. And then we did something that no other species on our planet did. She looked directly at the Shirek High Speaker. We made friends with them. The chamber was silent. We took wolves, pack predators with teeth designed to tear flesh, and we spent thousands of years turning them into companions that sleep in our beds and protect our children. We took horses, prey animals that could crush us with a single kick, and we rode them across continents. We took falcons and trained them to hunt for us. We kept venomous snakes in glass boxes in our homes, no reason other than because we thought they were beautiful. She pulled up another image, a human researcher using sign language with a gorilla. We taught a gorilla to talk to us, and when she learned enough words, do you know what she asked for? She asked for a pet cat. A murmur ran through the chamber, because the translators struggled with the concept, and several species had to have it explained twice. This is what humans do. It is not a skill we developed or a technology we invented. It is who we are at the most fundamental level. We are a species that looks at something dangerous and different, and our first instinct is not to kill it or run from it, but to try to understand it and connect with it. The Valori chief scientist stood and presented new data that had been gathered overnight, and the findings sent another wave of shock through the chamber. Human bioelectric signatures were uniquely low frequency compared to every other sapient species in the galactic database. That the Hexacarn's sensory systems did not register humans as a threat the way they registered every other species. Human vocal ranges included tones in a specific bandwidth that was soothing to the Hexacarn's auditory system, rather than triggering its defensive response. And human body temperature and chemical output were close enough to the Hexacarn's own biology that the creature's ancient instincts may have categorized Elena not as prey and not as a predator, but as something its species had not encountered in over 2 centuries of isolation, something familiar. But the biology only explains why it did not kill her immediately, the Valori scientist said, and her crystalline body was flickering with colors that meant deep fascination. It does not explain why it calmed down. It does not explain the physical contact. It does not explain the vocalization we are now calling the purring response. She turned to Elena. Ambassador, what you did in that enclosure was not passive. You actively communicated safety to a creature that has never been safely approached by any intelligent being. How? Elena shrugged, and the gesture confused several species who did not have shoulders. I read its body language, she said. I saw that its quills were extended because it was scared, and not because it wanted to attack. I saw that it was slamming against the walls because it was trying to get away from the noise, and not because it was trying to escape. I saw a frightened animal, and I did what any human would do with a frightened animal. And what is that? The Shirek High Speaker asked. I showed it that I was not a threat, and then I showed it that it was not alone. The political consequences unfolded over the following days, like a chain reaction that no one could stop. The Drakvan quietly withdrew their fleet from the neutral border, and when asked why, the ambassador said only that a species capable of that deserves a closer evaluation before we commit to any course of action, which was the Drakvan equivalent of saying they were deeply impressed. The Chirek Trade Coalition formally apologized for their earlier dismissal of humanity, and offered preferential trade terms, which Elena politely declined, because she understood that accepting a gift from the Chirek always came with invisible strings. 7 different species filed formal requests for human diplomatic mediators to help resolve long-standing conflicts, and the reasoning was identical in each request. A species that could empathize with a Jacarn could empathize with anyone. Elena returned to the containment wing that evening, and when she sat down outside the glass, The Ajakarn was already waiting for her. It had heard her footsteps. She placed her hand against the glass, and the creature pressed its snout to the same spot on the other side, and the low purring vibration hummed through the barrier. Into her palm. "I am going to call you Goliath," she said, "because you are very large, and because the original Goliath was also misunderstood." Goliath closed his eyes, and the purring grew louder. In the council archives, a Nithari elder, who had observed the proceedings in total silence for the entire crisis, finally spoke. And the words carried through the chamber, in a frequency that every species could feel in their bones. "We have been wrong about the nature of strength." 6 months had passed since the day Elena Vasquez walked into the enclosure of the most dangerous creature in the known galaxy, and the universe had not stopped talking about it. The footage had been viewed more times than any other recording in the history of the Galactic Network, and it had been analyzed and debated and studied by scientists, philosophers, and military strategists from every corner of known space. But the footage was just the beginning. The Vorketh crisis had been resolved 3 months after Elena's encounter with Goliath, and the resolution had come not through war or sanctions or endless study, but through a joint diplomatic effort led by humans and Valeroi working together. Elena had been at the center of those negotiations, and she had brought to the table something that no other species could offer: the ability to sit across from beings who hated each other and make both sides feel heard. The Drakvon warlords who had started the conflict were accustomed to diplomats who feared them and who agreed to their demands simply to avoid violence. But Elena did not fear them, and she did not agree with them, and somehow that made them respect her more than any diplomat they had ever faced. She told the Drakvon general directly that his territorial expansion was wrong, and that the refugees deserved to go home, and she said it while looking him straight in his burning red eyes, without flinching. The general had stared at her for a very long time, and then he had laughed, a sound like boulders grinding together, and he had said, "You are the one who touched the Shah Karn." And Elena had said, "Yes," and the general had said, "Then I will listen to what you have to say, because anyone who can do that has earned the right to speak." The refugees returned home, and the border was restored, and the crisis that had threatened to tear the galaxy apart was over, and it had ended not with weapons, but with words spoken by a woman who was brave enough to use them. Humanity's status in the Galactic Council changed officially on the 183rd day after the incident. The Council voted by an overwhelming majority to grant humans a new designation that had never existed before: Bridge Species. It was a formally recognized role that meant humans would serve as mediators and first contact specialists and interspecies liaisons across the galaxy. And it came with a permanent seat at the center of the Grand Chamber, rather than in the nursery at the back. The Chirek High Speaker announced the designation, and even his pheromones carried a scent that the translators identified as genuine admiration, which was something the Chirek almost never felt for anyone other than themselves. Humanity is not granted this role because of military strength or technological advancement or economic power, the High Speaker said. It is granted because humans possess something that is rare in this galaxy: the instinct to reach toward what is different and try to understand it rather than destroy it. Elena accepted the designation on behalf of her species, and she kept her remarks brief, because she had learned that the most powerful thing a person could say in the Grand Chamber was usually the shortest thing. Meanwhile, the changes around Goliath had been just as dramatic. The containment protocols that had governed the Shah Karn for over 2 centuries were completely revised based on Elena's observations and recommendations. A team of human-animal behaviorists had arrived on Velunis Station, and they had worked with Valeri xenobiologists to design a new habitat for Goliath, one that eliminated the electromagnetic interference and sonic pollution that had been driving him into constant distress. The new enclosure was enormous, and filled with terrain modeled after the Shakaran homeworld's surface, with dark volcanic rock and bioluminescent vegetation and atmospheric conditions that matched the creature's native environment as closely as galactic science could manage. The first time Goliath was moved into the new habitat, he had stood perfectly still for nearly an hour, and Elena had watched from the observation platform with tears in her eyes, because she understood that he was feeling something he had not felt in 200 years. He was feeling comfortable. In the weeks that followed, the xenobiologists made discoveries that rewrote everything the galaxy thought it knew about the Shakaran. The creatures were not mindless predators, and they were not biological weapons, and they were not the monsters that 2 centuries of fear had made them into. They were intelligent, possibly sapient, with evidence of complex problem-solving and long-term memory and emotional responses that were far more nuanced than anyone had imagined. Goliath recognized individual humans by their footsteps, and he responded differently to different people, and he had clear preferences and moods, and he communicated through a range of vocalizations and body postures that the human behaviorists were slowly learning to read. He was also lonely in a way that went beyond simple isolation, because the researchers discovered evidence that Shakaran on their homeworld lived in social groups, and that Goliath had been taken from his kind as a juvenile, and had spent his entire adult life alone. When Elena read that report, she sat in the observation room and pressed her hand against the glass, and said, "We are going to fix this." And Goliath pressed his snout to the glass on the other side, and the purring vibration hummed through the station. The council voted unanimously to authorize an expedition to the Shakaran homeworld, the first contact mission in over 2 centuries, and for the first time in galactic history, the mission would be led by humans. The logic was simple and irrefutable. If any species in the galaxy could approach the Shakaran and survive, then it was the species that had already done it. Elena was chosen to lead the expedition, and she accepted without hesitation. On the day of departure, the Grand Chamber held a formal ceremony, and delegates from every member species were present, and the Drakvan general, who had nearly started a war 6 months earlier, stood at attention as Elena passed, and he saluted her in the Drakvan tradition, a closed fist pressed to the chest plate over the heart. Elena returned the salute, and the general's red eyes softened in a way that his officers had never seen before. The expedition ship was called the Outstretched Hand, and it was a joint construction by 12 species, the first collaborative vessel in Council history, and it carried a crew of 200 from 30 different civilizations. But the first contact team was entirely human, because this was a job that only humans could do. Cargo bay of the ship, a specially designed habitat module, held Goliath, and he was calm, and his quills were flat, and his amber eyes tracked the stars through the observation window, with an expression that the human behaviorists had started calling curiosity. Elena visited him every evening during the journey, just as she had done on the station, and she sat beside him with her hand on his snout, and she told him about Earth. She told him about the wolves that humans had turned into friends, and the horses that had carried them across the world, and the dolphins that swam beside their boats for no reason other than the joy of it. She told him about the gorilla who had asked for a pet cat, and about the old dogs in shelters who just wanted someone to sit with them. She told him that they were going to take him home. On the last evening before they reached the Shakaran homeworld, Elena stood before the full council, one final time via long-range communication. The delegate asked her the question that the entire galaxy wanted answered. How can humans be so fearless in the face of the unknown? Elena smiled, and her bandaged hand, still healing from the electromagnetic burns she had received 6 months ago, rested on the railing in front of her. "We are not fearless," she said. "We were terrified every step of the way. I was terrified when I walked into that enclosure, and my hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding, and every part of me wanted to run." She paused. "But on Earth, We learned something a long time ago. The things that scare us the most are usually the things that need kindness the most. The transmission ended, and the grand chamber was quiet. And the silence was not the silence of fear or confusion, but the silence of 10,000 civilizations reconsidering everything they believed about strength and courage, and what it truly meant to be dangerous. The next morning the outstretched hand entered orbit around the Jacquard homeworld, and Elena stood at the observation deck and looked down at a planet of dark rock and red storms and bioluminescent forests that glowed like emerald fire beneath the clouds. Beside her, Goliath stood at his own observation window, and his amber eyes were wide, and his 6 legs shifted with a restless energy that Elena had never seen in him before. He knew. He recognized his world, even after 2 centuries, and the sound he made was not a purr and not a roar, but something between the two, something deep and resonant and old, and it was the sound of a creature remembering where it came from. Elena placed her hand on his snout one more time, and Goliath leaned into her touch, and she whispered, "Let us go meet your family." The cargo bay doors opened, and the landing shuttle descended toward the surface, carrying a human woman and the most dangerous creature the galaxy had ever known, side by side. And somewhere in the grand chamber, light years away, the Nethari elder, who had spoken only once during the entire crisis, closed his luminous eyes and hummed a single note that resonated through the chamber, a note of profound and unshakable hope. The galaxy had always measured strength in firepower and in armor and in the ability to destroy. It had never occurred to them that the most extraordinary species in the universe might be the one that looked at a monster and said, "You just need a friend." Until the humans came along and proved it.